I stood in the middle of a Lara Milano's flagship boutique on the corner of Vespera Avenue and Fifth, and for 32 excruciating seconds, I was invisible. Not in the romantic sense, in the way that department store mirrors and a circle of immaculate saleswomen can make a size 18 woman feel like she has wandered into a room she was never meant to enter. The store smelled of white roses and money. That particular antiseptic smell of spaces designed to remind you subtly that everything inside them costs more than you are worth. The floors were pale marble, the lighting the color of early afternoon, flattering to the displays and quietly unkind to the women browsing them. I had walked past this boutique every morning for 2 years on my way to the Aldgate Street offices, 2 years of pausing at the window, 2 years of the ivory satin heels on the corner display, rotating slowly on a mirrored pedestal, catching the light like a dare. That morning, for the first time, I walked in. The heels were ivory satin, 3 inches, modest by runway standards, devastating by mine. I had held them up, turned them in the light, felt the weight of wanting something beautiful, and asked in a voice I worked very hard to keep steady if they came in a size 11. The silence that followed was not a silence at all. It was a verdict. One of the saleswomen, young, polished, with cheekbones that could cut glass and a smile that had never once been sincere, glanced at my feet and then at her colleague. And what passed between them in that half second was the entire architecture of my humiliation. The other one pressed her lips together. The third covered her mouth with 2 fingers, and then they laughed. Not loudly. That would have been easier. They laughed the way mean people have always laughed at me, softly, with their eyes, in a language I had been reading since middle school and never stopped being fluent in. "I'm so sorry," the first one said, and she was not sorry at all. "We only carry up to a size 9 in the limited collections. You might want to try the Comfort brands down the street." She said Comfort brands the way one says consolation prize. I felt it the way I always felt it. A precise surgical sting, beginning somewhere behind my sternum and radiating outward. I had a name for it, privately. I called it the tax levied on a body like mine for daring to want beautiful things. I set the shoes down on the velvet display stand with hands that did not shake. I was proud of that later. And I turned to leave. I had been leaving rooms like that my entire life. I had an entire internal system for it. The controlled exit, the deep breath in the elevator, the cry I would allow myself exactly once in the car before wiping my face and driving home to the apartment I paid for myself with the salary I had earned, with a brain these women would never be able to afford. My name is Celeste Mora. I am 31 years old. I have a master's degree in financial forensics from Whitmore University. I run the accounts for 3 legitimate and 2 considerably less legitimate companies. And I've been made to feel like my body is an apology for as long as I can remember. I had almost reached the door. Almost. "Those feet," someone behind me murmured, half laughing, and I heard a camera shutter, someone's phone, capturing what exactly? My exit, my size, my humiliation as content. And I felt the old, sick heat crawl up the back of my neck, and I stopped. Not because I was going to say something. I stopped because someone else was already speaking. I had spent 31 years making myself small enough to pass through rooms like this without collision, without incident, without costing anyone anything. The particular calculus of invisibility. How to angle your shoulders, how to hold your bag, how to answer a dismissal with a gracious nod that conceded nothing and cost you everything. I had mastered it the way other women mastered languages. Fluently, silently, at great personal expense. And I was so accustomed to the exit that it took me 2 full seconds to register that the voice was not directed at me. It was directed at the room, at the air, at the specific temperature of cruelty that had crystallized in this 20-foot square of marble and crystal and pale pink roses. And that temperature Whatever it had been a moment before was now dropping fast. The voice came from the back of the store, where I had not noticed anyone standing, because the man who stepped forward was the kind of presence that rearranges a room without moving. He was tall, not merely tall, but built with the deliberate geometry of something that had never been assembled carelessly. Dark suit, no tie, hair black as ground obsidian, and a face so still and cold that it made the February air outside feel temperate. I did not recognize him immediately. That is what I told myself afterward. The truth was that some part of my nervous system recognized him before my conscious mind caught up, the way prey animals register predators at a frequency below thought. He said 3 words, just 3, and he said them quietly. Not in anger, but in the register of a man who has never needed to raise his voice because the alternative to his quiet requests was not something anyone in this city wanted to contemplate. Lock the door. His lieutenant, a man the width of a shipping container, who materialized at the entrance without seeming to walk, turned the bolt. The sound of it, that small, clean click, was the loudest thing in the room. Every saleswoman in Ilara Milano went the color of old chalk. The one who had laughed opened her mouth. "Signore Varro, Be quiet," said Signore Varro, still in that same mild, winter-still voice, and she was. She went so thoroughly, completely quiet, that I could hear the ventilation system overhead and the muted percussion of the city through the glass. He walked toward me. I have been in rooms with powerful men before. I have sat across conference tables from board members who controlled more money than most municipalities, and never once let them see that my pulse had elevated. I was good at stillness. I had practiced it the way other women practiced yoga or languages. With discipline, with intention, with a full understanding that it was a survival skill. But when Luca Varro crossed that marble floor and stopped 2 feet in front of me and looked at me, not past me, not at my reflection in the mirror, but at me directly, with the focused attention of a man surveying something he considers his, I felt my composure do something it had not done in years. It faltered. "You're Celeste Mora," he said. It was not a question. I was then briefly terrified in an entirely different way. "I know who you are," I said, because I did. In this city you did not work in financial forensics, legitimate or otherwise, without knowing the name Luca Varro, the Iron Ghost. That was what the papers called him when they were brave enough to print his name at all. He was the man the city's worst feared. He was rumored to own 8 blocks of the financial district, the Port Authority, the building where my employer rented office space, and possibly the soul of the deputy mayor, though that last one I had never been able to confirm from the documentation. He looked at me for another moment, long enough that I became aware of exactly how I was standing, where my weight was distributed, the slight lift of my chin that I defaulted to when I was hiding something. Then he turned and addressed the saleswoman who had laughed. "Every shoe in this store," he said, "every style, in her size, boxed and delivered to whatever address she provides. Tonight." He paused. "And the building." He said the second sentence to his lieutenant, who was already on the phone. "What building?" I asked before I could stop myself. "This one," said Luca Varro, and there was something in the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but was the suggestion of one, distant and private, like a comet that only swung close enough to see once in a century. "You're buying the entire shoe store?" I said. "Yes," he said. "Simple, absolute." The saleswoman made a sound that I will treasure for the remainder of my natural life. "Why," I said carefully, "would you do that?" And Luca Varro looked at me again with those depthless charcoal eyes and said, at barely above a whisper, "Because they laughed. And nothing in this building should be permitted to laugh at you." I went home that night with a mind that refused to settle and a phone that had 3 new messages from an unknown number by the time I reached my apartment on the 14th floor of the Creston building on Aldgate Street. I stood in the elevator and read them twice. The first message was an address. The second was a time, 7 in the morning. The third was a single sentence. There is a matter I would prefer to discuss with you in person, if you are willing. It was signed simply, LV. I stood in my kitchen in the dark for a long time, holding my phone, telling myself all the reasonable things. That Luca Vara was dangerous. That men like him didn't buy shoe stores for women they didn't know out of chivalry. That whatever his reason for knowing my name, it was almost certainly connected to one of the 5 companies whose accounts I managed, and at least 2 of those connections should terrify me. I stood there long enough that the automatic lights clicked off and left me in the dark with nothing but the blue glow of my phone and the sound of the city 14 floors below. I thought about the way the saleswoman had laughed. I thought about the way my hands had not shaken when I set those shoes down. I thought about the way Luca Vero had said my name, not like a question, not like a threat, but like a fact he had already decided about and filed away somewhere important. I thought about 31 years of controlled exits and careful posture and strategic invisibility, and I typed back, "I'll be there." I set the phone down on the counter and stood in the dark for another moment, waiting for the panic to arrive. It didn't. What arrived instead was something quieter, something that lived below the level of reasoning, a pull, like the sensation of a tide changing direction underwater. The kind of shift you feel before you see. I was not naive. I understood what a name like Luca Varo, attached to a late-night message, meant for a woman alone in an apartment on the 14th floor. I had run the accounts for men who occupied adjacent worlds, and I knew that the gravity of those worlds did not stop at the edge of polite society. I knew, too, that the reasonable thing and the correct thing were not always the same thing, and something about the way he had said nothing in this building should be permitted to laugh at you. Not as flattery, not as performance, but as a simple statement of a fact he intended to enforce. Had located something in me that had been dormant for a very long time. I wore my gray wool suit to the address, which turned out to be a private dining room on the 22nd floor of the Aldenmere Hotel, not the sort of place that appeared in tourism guides, the sort of place that existed because certain people in the city needed to meet without being observed. The elevator required a key card I had been sent by courier at 6:15 that morning, along with a single white card bearing only the floor number and the time. Luca Varo was already there when I arrived at 7:02. He stood when I entered, which I had not expected. He waited until I sat before he sat, which I had also not expected. There was coffee on the table, the very good kind, in a pot that was still hot, in a cup already poured, as though someone had known exactly when I would arrive and prepared accordingly. Knowing what I know now, they had. And then he slid a manila folder across the table and said, in that same quiet way, "Tell me what you see." Inside the folder was a set of accounts. I recognized the format immediately. It was the internal ledger style of a firm I knew, a firm that used the same double-column bookkeeping architecture I had helped design 3 years ago when I was hired as an independent consultant. I went still. "You know whose these are," he said. It was not a question either. "Who gave you access to Falconer Reed's internal system?" I asked instead of answering. "The same person," he said, "who has been siphoning from my assets through their subsidiary accounts for 14 months. I want to know how they did it, and I want proof that will hold in a room with serious men." I looked at the numbers for a long time. Then I looked at him. "You could have hired anyone," I said. "I hired you," he said, "because you are the only person in this city who designed the system they're exploiting, and because," he added without looking away, "I prefer to work with people who don't flinch." He did not explain what he meant. He didn't need to. 3 days, he said. He needed the full forensic analysis in 3 days. In exchange, he named a figure that was the equivalent of my annual salary. I told him I would need direct access to 2 more subsidiary ledgers and a very good cup of coffee. He smiled then. The first real one, brief and strange, like a single bar of music in a quiet building. and said he would see what he could do about the coffee. The next 72 hours dissolved into numbers and the particular silence of work that matters. Luca Varro gave me an office on the secured floor of his building, a glass-walled room with a mahogany desk and a view of the harbor, and a coffee machine that cost more than my first car. And I sat in it for 3 days and unspooled what someone had done to his accounts the way a surgeon removes a thing that has no right to be there. The coffee, for what it is worth, was extraordinary. Single origin, from a small estate in a mountain region whose name I could not pronounce, ground fresh each morning by a member of his household staff who delivered it at 7 without being asked. I notice these things because noticing things is what I do. It is, in its way, what I am for. It was elegant, what they'd built. I will give them that. A web of shell transfers, time-delayed redistributions, currency conversion laundering that looked on any surface examination like legitimate interbank friction. Most forensic accountants would have flagged 3 anomalies and called it human error. I found 29. I cataloged them on a legal pad first, in my own shorthand, and then built a secondary ledger in the secured system his IT team had provisioned for me, cross-referencing each anomaly against the 12-month international currency fluctuation records and the holding company registry data for 4 separate offshore jurisdictions. It was painstaking. It was also the most engaged I had felt in 3 years of work. I found the pattern because I recognized the handwriting, so to speak. The architecture of the fraud had a signature, a particular way of burying the trail in the 3rd decimal place of a converted currency value. And I had seen it before. Once, in my own work 3 years ago, in a method I had developed and used and then deliberately abandoned because it made me uncomfortable how invisible it could be made. Someone had studied my work. Someone had taken my method and used it against the most feared man in the city, which meant either they were very brave or very stupid. And the more I looked at the account numbers, the more I understood they were neither. They were very, very careful. And they had made, buried in month 11 of the 14-month operation, exactly one mistake. A single routing number reused across 2 transactions that should never have touched each other. A lapse so small that it would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't built the original architecture and knew precisely where the seams were. I found it at 2:17 in the morning of the 2nd day, in the still, sharp quiet that follows the point of exhaustion and enters the territory of clarity. I wrote the number down twice, circled it, pressed my pen into the page hard enough to leave an impression on the sheet below, and then sat in the glass-walled office, looking at the harbor lights below. A container ship moving slow and purposeful through the dark water, feeling the very particular satisfaction of a thing discovered that was never meant to be found. On the 3rd morning, I printed 87 pages of documentation and walked them into the room where Luca Varro was waiting, and set them on the table and said, "It's his CFO. A man named Gregor Ansel. He's been routing through a holding company registered in the name of your CFO's brother-in-law in a city 3 time zones away. He started with small amounts, under 15,000, all inside the noise threshold of your standard audit protocol, and scaled up once he was confident no one was looking. Total extraction over 14 months, $4.3 million US. I paused. He used my method, I said. He modified it slightly, but the architecture is mine. I developed it in 2021 as part of a theoretical paper I never published. Someone accessed my draft files. The room was very quiet. Luca Varro looked at the documents for a long time, not skimming, reading, with the focused patience of a man accustomed to reading things that matter. Then he looked at me. "You're certain," he said. "I am," I said. "I'm always certain." Something moved in his expression. It was not quite warmth. Warmth was too small a word for what crossed his face. But it was the recognition of someone encountering, for the first time in a long time, something that matched their own standard of exactness. Good, he said quietly, and then, after a moment, thank you, Celeste. He said my name the way nobody had said it in recent memory, like it was a complete sentence. What happened to Gregor Ansel is not something I was in the room for, and I did not ask. I understood by then enough about the world Luca Varro occupied to know that the justice dispensed in it was not the kind that required courtrooms, filing deadlines, or the measured deliberation of a jury. Some accounts are settled by other means, in other rooms, by other hands, and the outcome arrives in the world as a silence rather than a verdict. What I know is that on the fourth day, my phone rang at 8 in the morning, and it was Luca Varro's voice, and he said simply, "It's been handled." There was something in the flat certainty of those 3 words that I chose not to examine too carefully. And then, after a pause that had a quality I could not name precisely, not awkward, but weighted, deliberate, like the moment before a signature. "I would like to have dinner with you tonight if you're willing. Not a business matter." I stood in my apartment in yesterday's clothes, with unwashed hair and a mind full of the lingering static of 3 days of forensic accounting, and I said, "Are you asking me to dinner?" "Yes," he said. "I don't typically ask twice." I believed him completely. "I'm not dressed," I said. "I'll send someone," he said, "with clothes." "I can dress myself," I said, slightly offended. "I know," he said, and the warmth was there again, faint and private, like light seen through a very narrow window from a very great distance. "I'd simply like to send something. Will you let me?" I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. The woman looking back at me was tired and sharp-eyed, and had just dismantled a $4 million fraud operation in 72 hours in a borrowed glass office overlooking the harbor. She had dark circles and a coffee stain on her sleeve, and her hair had given up entirely sometime around hour 40 of the 72. She was also, if she was being fair to herself, the most technically accomplished person in the room in which that dismantling had taken place. And the room had belonged to the most feared man in the city. "Fine," I said. The dress arrived at noon, carried by a woman from an atelier I recognized by the discreet black box alone. Maison Vérin, whose waiting list ran 18 months for appointments and whose sample sizes began where most designers ended. The box was tied with matte black ribbon. Inside the tissue paper, folded with the reverence typically reserved for things that have earned it, was deep green silk. It was from a designer whose name I recognized from the kind of magazine I used to flip through in waiting rooms and never bought because nothing in it was made for a body like mine. But this was not a sample size. This was not a standard size stretched to approximate. It was made, clearly unmistakably made, in the hours since we had spoken, or perhaps in the days before in anticipation, which I did not let myself think about too carefully, for exactly the shape of me. Deep green silk that moved like water, a cut that didn't try to minimize anything. That let my body be what it was, substantial, present, occupying space with an authority the dress seemed to endorse rather than apologize for. There was a note, on heavy cream cardstock, in handwriting that was spare and angular, and surprisingly legible. "You dress armor. Tonight, wear a crown instead." I stood in front of my mirror for a very long time. Long enough that the afternoon light shifted, and the room went amber and then gold. I could not entirely explain what happened to me in those minutes, but something in my chest, something that had been bracing since approximately the 7th grade, relaxed. Not all the way, but enough to breathe differently. Enough that I stood in front of that mirror in the green silk dress and did something I had not done in longer than I could accurately recall. I looked at myself without immediately beginning to list corrections. Without the running inventory of inadequacies that had been the background noise of my interior life since I was 13 years old, and a boy at a school dance had loudly announced that I was taking up too much of the floor. I looked at myself, and I saw a woman in a dress that had been made for exactly her, by a man who had chosen to see her exactly as she was, and I thought, this is what it feels like to be looked at without being evaluated. This is what it feels like to be seen. I had not known, until that moment, that I had been waiting for it. Enough to look at myself. Really look, without flinching, without cataloging all the distances between what I was and what I had been made to feel I was supposed to be. And see something I had not seen before. Not beauty exactly. Not yet. But the clear-eyed beginning of it. The restaurant was on the top floor of a building that did not publicly acknowledge having a top floor. It had a view of the entire city laid out like an illuminated map. And when Lucavaro stood to greet me, there was something in his face that I needed a moment to catalog. Not because it was subtle, because it was the opposite, direct and unguarded in a way that seemed entirely involuntary, which I suspected was not a state he entered often. He looked at me the way I imagined cartographers had once looked at coastlines they were the first to chart. Like something was being recorded that mattered. Like the act of seeing it clearly was itself a form of claiming it. We ate. We talked. About accounting systems, about the city, about the paper I had never published and whether I would, about a book he had read 3 times that I had never heard of, about the harbor visible below us through the glass and what it looked like in winter, which he preferred. He had an opinion on everything and volunteered none of them unprompted. He asked me questions and listened to my answers with his entire attention, which is rarer than people suppose in men with power. He had a quality of stillness in listening that reminded me, oddly, of the way I worked. The suspension of all other processes, the full allocation of attention to the problem at hand. He listened to me describe the architecture of the fraud with the focused interest of a man who already understood the technical dimensions and wanted to understand the mind that had constructed them. He asked 3 questions in an hour. Each of them landed precisely at the point in my explanation where I had assumed I would need to simplify, and each revealed that simplification would have been unnecessary. I found, to my considerable surprise, that I was enjoying myself. Not in the polite, managed way I had learned to enjoy professionally obligatory meals. Actually, genuinely, unexpectedly enjoying the company of a man who was reportedly the most dangerous person in 4 city districts and who had, this week, bought a shoe store on my behalf. Most powerful men listen only long enough to locate the next thing they want to say. Lucavaro listened the way he presumably did everything, completely, without remainder. Toward the end of dinner, he said, without preamble, "The store." He meant Ilara Milano. "What about it?" I said. "I've had it renamed," he said. "The new management will be instructed on several policies, the primary one being that customers are not assessed by the dimensions of their bodies." I looked at him. "You actually bought it," I said. "I said I would," he said. He said it like the purchase of a luxury boutique on Vespera Avenue was as unremarkable as buying a newspaper. "And the shoes?" I said. 47 pairs arrived at my apartment the following morning, I would later discover, in boxes tied with black ribbon. But that evening he simply said, "All of them. Every size you asked for, and a few you didn't." He reached across the table, not taking my hand, but placing his hand next to mine on the white linen, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him. And he said, very quietly, "You designed a system elegant enough that it took 4 years for anyone to try to exploit it, and another 72 hours for you to dismantle the attempt completely. You are the most precisely brilliant person I have encountered in 38 years of paying very close attention to people." He paused. "The women in that store were wrong about you, not in the way people are casually wrong, in the way that reveals the limits of their vision. I find limited vision," he said, with the faint shadow of that rare smile, "offensive." I looked out at the city that was, if half of what I had heard was accurate, largely his. "You're a very strange man," I said. "Yes," he agreed without concern. "Are you going to kiss me, or just keep the table between us?" I asked. He looked at me for a moment with those still serious eyes. Then he stood, walked around the table, offered his hand, and when I took it, when I stood, he looked at me from a distance of approximately 8 inches and said, so quietly that it was nearly inaudible beneath the ambient sound of the city below, "You are exactly what I intend to keep, Celeste." He kissed me the way the city looks at night, all at once, without apology, and with the suggestion of depths that would take a lifetime to fully map. 3 weeks later, I walked back into Ilara Milano on Luca's arm. Not because I needed to, not because I had anything to prove. I had settled in those weeks into a certainty about myself that felt structural, like load-bearing, like it would not shift in a wind. Something had changed the night of the green dress and the rooftop dinner and the kiss that tasted like the city in winter, and the change was not temporary. It had not faded in the morning light or shrunk in the particular cruelty of the ordinary hours. It had instead become more itself, settled deeper, found its footing, begun to build. I walked back in because Luca asked me to, lightly, one morning over coffee in the kitchen of his penthouse on the harbor, and said, "I'd like you to see what it looks like now." And there was something in his voice that made me say yes. Not a dare, not a test. Just the quiet confidence of a man who had built something he wanted to show to the person whose opinion he had decided was the one that mattered. The store had new staff, new displays, a section near the entrance that ran the full range of sizes without apology or segregation. Simply shoes arranged by style, not by the assumption of who might wear them. The lighting was warmer. The marble floors were the same, but the mirrors, those terrible, merciless mirrors that retail spaces wielded like instruments of measurement, had been repositioned and reframed, lit from below rather than above, in the way that good portrait photographers know makes every face its best self. The young manager who greeted us at the door had a warmth in her that was professional and genuine at once, and she looked at me, not at Luca, not at his suit or his reputation, or the weight of his name in the room, which was considerable. She looked at me and said, "Ms. Mora, we have several styles set aside that I think you'll love." I tried on 7 pairs. I wore the ivory satin heels to a charity gala 2 nights later. They fit. Of course they fit. And when Luca Varro placed his hand at the small of my back as we walked into the Aldenmere Grand Ballroom, and when the room shifted the way rooms do, when the iron ghost of the city enters with a woman on his arm and looks at her like she is the only fixed point in his longitude, I felt nothing of the old heat on the back of my neck. No impulse toward the controlled exit, no bracing, no tax. I felt, for perhaps the first time in my adult life, entirely and exactly where I belonged. He leaned down slightly and said, against my hair, "You look like the queen of everything you survey." "I know," I said, and I meant it. Not as performance, not as bravado, not as the careful armor of a woman who has spent 3 decades convincing a hostile world that she is worth its consideration. I meant it the way you mean things that have become simply structurally true. The way you know your own address. The way you recognize your own handwriting on a page. It had taken a shoe store, a locked door, a manila folder of fraudulent accounts, a green silk dress, and a man who bought an entire building because something in it had laughed at me. It had taken longer than it should have, but it had arrived. I was here. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not the way I had sometimes told myself I meant it in bathroom mirrors, before difficult meetings, using the words as a kind of armor pulled on in haste. I meant it the way you mean things that have become true slowly, in layers, one quiet moment at a time, until they are simply the fact of you. If you just finished this story and your jaw is still somewhere on the floor, you are not alone. I am still not over the moment Luca bought the entire store, and I don't think I ever will be. If this gave you chills, if you cheered when Celeste walked back in wearing those ivory heels, if Luca Varro saying, "You are exactly what I intend to keep," made you put your hand over your heart, then please give this video a like right now because it genuinely means the world and it helps more people find these stories. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that the people who laugh at you in fitting rooms will one day be working for the building owned by the man who chose you. Because that is the kind of energy we are building here. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next story. Because I promise you, what's coming next is going to ruin you in the best possible way. And drop a comment. Would you have gone back to that store, or would you have simply let Luca's purchase speak for itself? Tell me everything. I read every single one. See you in the next story.